For over 100 years, battles have raged in the air for command of the skies.
If you don't have air supremacy, you're in trouble.
Since its earliest beginnings in World War I, the airplane is the supreme weapon of the armed forces.
This was a real battle for civilization, for humanity.
It revolutionized battle and changed the ways war was fought and won.
The F-117 has obviously changed how we design aircraft and air campaigns.
War drove innovation in the skies.
What we hear from the Air Force is when the F-35 wasn't there, all others died. When F-35 was there, they reigned supreme.
Aircraft bred a new kind of hero. The fate of entire nations depended on the bravery of a handful of men.
An appreciation of the extent to which young men were willing to put their lives on the line for an ideal is something we need to remember more often than we do.
In this episode, by 1940, Germany had conquered most of Europe. Hitler's next target was a small island across the English Channel, Britain. In the summer of that year, Britain prepared for an all-out air attack to defend the country from Nazi Germany.
I think it's very important to recognise that the Battle of Britain was really designed to prevent the German invasion of the United Kingdom. That's what it was about.
Britain's Royal Air Force was in the front line to defend against a German invasion.
The Battle of Britain was the first huge air battle ever fought.
This would be an air battle that would decide the fate of Britain and the course of World War II.
It's the first time that one nation had tried to defeat another, primarily by defeating its air force. The stakes were incredibly high.
I think the feeling of the German Air Force was, there is no enemy in the world we cannot fight against.
All that stood in the way of Nazi Germany were the fighter pilots of Britain's Royal Air Force. In air combat, pilots lived and died by the Golden Rule.
The element of surprise was absolutely vital.
Pilots of the Royal Air Force faced overwhelming odds against the German Luftwaffe, which outnumbered British planes.
You've got men who can only fly so many times a day. Even though they did fly from dawn to dusk, they were facing exhaustion, they were taking losses.
The fight for freedom was about to begin.
It was one of the great decisive battles of the Second World War.
July 1940. Britain was about to fight an air war against the German Luftwaffe Air Force. It would be one of the most decisive battles of World War II. Britain faced the might of the Third Reich alone. After the evacuation of British troops at Dunkirk in May 1940 and the fall of France to Nazi Germany, Hitler's continued conquest of Europe and Britain seemed unstoppable.
Britain is in a terrible state in the summer of 1940. It's fought a battle in Europe against the Germans. It's been very badly beaten, as have the French. France is about to fall. There's been this ignominious Dunkirk episode when the entire British Army is evacuated, leaving all its equipment behind.
Hitler drew up plans to invade Britain, codenamed Operation Sea Lion. But standing in his way were the pilots of the Royal Air Force.
The other thing, of course, was it was recognised very early on that if they were to have any chance of success, they would have to defeat Britain in the air, or at least wear down its air defences.
German Reichsmarshal Hermann Göring was determined to strike immediately, when the Royal Air Force was at its weakest.
I think we ought to remember that the RAF had been in action throughout the whole Battle of France. They'd been fighting very, very hard there. They then had to defend the British troops as they were being evacuated off the beaches of Dunkirk. So they'd been fighting very, very hard, and they'd taken a lot of losses.
We had less fighter pilots than they had, so their numbering outnumbered us completely.
Germany's Hermann Göring thought he could win the battle for the skies in just 4 weeks. His first targets were British shipping and ports. Britain imported 100% of its oil, 50% of its food, and 60% of its raw materials. By targeting shipping convoys, he believed he could quickly bring Britain to its knees.
There's no disguising the fact that 2/3 of these essential goods came from overseas. And if you couldn't keep the sea lanes open, then you were in real trouble.
Defending shipping convoys near to Britain's shores was the job of Britain's fighter planes. Leading the charge was the legendary Supermarine Spitfire.
Spitfire was a wonderful machine, but it was also a wonderful symbol, and people came to see it as a symbol of Britishness quite early on. It was small, but it was very strong, and it was very resolute, very determined, and deadly when aroused. So it became a great British symbol, as well as being a fantastic fighting machine.
Armed with 8 7.7 Browning machine guns, the Spitfire could attack at speeds of over 360 miles per hour at high altitude.
The Spitfires were to do what was called in military parlance fly top cover to protect the Hurricanes from the escorting fighters.
Flying alongside the Spitfire was the Hawker Hurricane.
The Hurricane was given the role of attacking the bombers. The Spitfire was used to attack the top cover fighters.
These were the British fighter planes that would take on the German Luftwaffe. Both types of fighters used a combat air tactic learned from World War I. The fighter would use the sun to blind the enemy.
Both of them would, if possible, try to get up sun or into the sun, because we all know if you're trying to look into the sun, you can't see anything at all. Beware of the Hun in the sun, but the Germans would say beware of the Spitfire or the Hurricane in the sun. It gives them a visual advantage to dive down into the aircraft.
The opening salvos in the Battle of Britain began in July 1940, as the German Luftwaffe began targeting shipping with small raids on Britain's southern shores.
The first opening phase was with German aircraft in considerable but not enormous numbers coming over the coast, shooting up convoys, doing reconnaissance missions to find out where the bases were.
Germany needed to know how powerful Britain's defences were.
During this period, to a degree, the Germans are testing Britain's defences by attacking soft targets and testing how the British respond.
But during the 1930s, Air Chief Marshal Sir Hugh Dowding, the controller of Fighter Command, created a network of radar stations to protect Britain.
By the time the battle opened, we actually had a pretty good radar system which would give us plenty of warning of the arrival of big fleets of aircraft, and it allowed that information to be filtered back to command and control centres that could then decide how to react to it.
By 1940, a chain of 20 radar stations were built on Britain's coast, ready to give early warning of enemy planes.
It was, at the time, the most elaborate defensive network in existence.
The advanced technology of radar wasn't the only defence the British had, though. All along the coast, stationed on small piles of sandbags, binoculars in hand, 30,000 men and women of the Observer Corps scanned the skies for enemy planes. The combination of radar and manned observation posts was known as the Dowding system.
What was crucial about it was that it was filtering out information that was being brought by all of this new information that we were using with radar, with the Observer Corps, and that information was filtering down into usable information. The speed at which that happened was incredible. They had like 4 minutes to be able to turn this information around.
Eyesight was still an essential part of Britain's defences.
They were vital. Without that information, without men on the ground, without the radar that came through that was giving them information, without the Observer Corps, which became the Royal Observer Corps, we wouldn't be where we are today. They were the eyes and ears of Britain.
Information from British radar stations began identifying German planes off its coast. Bentley Priory was the home of Fighter Command during the Second World War.
It is just the most important place for the Battle of Britain. It was the absolute action centre for where everything came in and went out.
Sir Hugh Dowding created the network to marshal his air force effectively against the enemy.
You had to be able to hold it together, centrally control it, direct fighters to where the fighting was actually needed. And he insisted, pushed that all through in the late 1930s.
On the morning of July the 10th, 1940, a fleet of merchant ships prepared to set out to sea, headed for Dorset on the south coast.
That's when a big convoy called Bread came out into the channel from the Thames estuary and was attacked in force by German aircraft. They themselves were then attacked in turn by the defenders.
It was the target for an armada of German raiders. Britain's No. 74 Squadron was scrambled to intercept German aircraft. But the British fighters were in for a surprise.
The German tactics were actually pretty good. You'd have these big armadas of bombers coming in at 15,000 feet, say, and then above them, lurking in the sun, these great swarms of Me-109. So they were there to come down and dive on the British fighters as they came in to attack the bombers. And that worked quite well.
But both the British Spitfire and Hurricane fighters were about to confront the German Luftwaffe's lethal fighter plane, a plane that had previously conquered both the French and Polish air forces, the Messerschmitt Me-109.
It was also deadly against the French and the British, which is actually what controlled the skies over France and ended up with Britain coming into the Battle of Britain on its own, trying to match the fighters that Germany already had.
What followed next on July the 10th was the first dogfight of the Battle of Britain. German and British planes engaged in a violent game of tag above the Straits of Dover on Britain's south coast.
For the first time, these guys would have been involved in a mass battle.
They manoeuvre, they try to get behind each other or underneath each other, they can inflict some damage, they're always looking out behind them for what's going on, they wheel away and so on.
Everywhere you look, there's drama, there are machines flashing in front of you, over you, under you. It's incredibly hard to actually work out what's going on, who is friend and who is foe. And so it's massive confusion.
British RAF pilots jostled for position in the skies over England.
And Hurricanes really took the brunt of the initial attacks in the Battle of Britain. Now, the Hurricane aircraft was manoeuvrable and reasonably fast.
It was the equal of both the Messerschmitt 109 and the Spitfire of the time, and was more manoeuvrable. It could pull tighter turns.
Manoeuvrability for British fighters was a very important aspect, I think, of their success during this period.
It wasn't quite as good in the acceleration as either the Spitfire or its opponent, the Me-109, but it made up for that in other ways by its manoeuvrability and by its strength, so it could take a lot of punishment without actually being knocked down. If there was a weakness, it was really the absence of two things. One is initially self-sealing tanks. So the Germans had self-sealing tanks, so that meant if your fuel tank got hit in a British plane, it would immediately erupt into flame in the early days, which meant you were a goner. The other thing on the strictly mechanical front was the absence at the beginning of fuel injection.
The Me-109 had an advantage which neither the Hurricane nor the Spitfire could match. The Me-109 had a Daimler-Benz engine which had fuel injection.
Which meant that the Messerschmitt could outmaneuver a lot of the aircraft it came up against.
One of the techniques that a 109 pilot would use to get away from another aircraft or to put himself into a better position to attack it would be to bunt, which is to push the nose of the aircraft over, which gets negative G. The engine would not, of course, lose any power. It would continue working all the way down. The Spitfire or the Hurricane that's behind him, if that bunts over like that, the negative G causes the floats to go up and the engine could actually stop working for some time.
Unable to function when the Spitfire was forced into a steep dive, the engine was starved of fuel and stalled.
The engine that was fuel injected in the 109 just kept going, so he immediately accelerated away into the dive.
This meant that the Messerschmitt engine could still fire on all cylinders, even in a loop or a dive. But the Spitfire, which used gravity to pump fuel, could not. Losing power, the Spitfire was vulnerable to attack from the Messerschmitt.
And that few seconds without power could be the difference between life and death.
The German Messerschmitt Me-109 was a force to be reckoned with.
The Me-109 was more heavily armed, and it took some time before Fighter Command recognised that the machine guns they had were not entirely satisfactory.
But the Me-109 had some fatal drawbacks for its pilots too.
The Messerschmitt 109, due to its very narrow landing gear, was a very difficult aircraft for takeoff and landing, and as many aircraft and pilots were lost in landing and takeoff accidents as were actually lost in air-to-air combat.
But once mastered, it was a lethal killing machine.
Well, the 109 was a brand new, very fast aircraft and with a very powerful engine and a very good engine, which was a little better than the British engines.
What you're trying to do is get behind your opponent and hit him with your machine gun bullets.
It's a question then of who can get on the tail of the other aircraft the quickest. Having done that, you've then got to be very, very good with your shooting. That's the big thing. You try to follow, you tail chase in a way, the other aircraft to try and get within 200 to 300 yards ideally, closer if you can.
As well as fighting the enemy, pilots had to battle against immense G-forces. In a steep turn or dive, body weight increases up to 6 times, with potentially fatal results.
Blacking out was a completely routine event. So you're dealing with all these things, and then you have to actually work out how to shoot this very nimble, moving object in front of you. Success or failure depends on 3 things. It depends on the machine, it depends on your skill as a pilot, and it depends also on luck.
Each British pilot chose their own way to attack the German enemy.
There are many different ways of attacking upon the fleet. You could attack it from the sides. Some people chose to attack it head-on, which was hair-raising action, as you can imagine, which required enormous guts.
Attacking German bombers head-on was a tactic Britain's 111th Squadron chose to use when it scrambled to meet the Luftwaffe.
If you see a fighter plane coming straight at you, it's a very, very unnerving experience, and your instinct is to turn away, which is what many of these bombers did.
It was one way in which you might be able to inflict fatal damage on the bomber aircraft. And they're both moving at extremely high speed, and so you have to be absolutely razor-sharp in your reactions to make sure that you inflict damage and then avoid the worst.
It broke up the formation, which meant they were less able to defend themselves, and it meant for them effectively the attack was over and they really were heading for home.
Defending Britain's shores were pilots from all over Europe.
There were about 3,000 pilots from 17 different countries who fought throughout the Battle of Britain, and the Polish and the Czechs were said to be some of the most adventurous and daring of all of our pilots.
Survival rates for aircrew increased as more pilots gained combat experience.
Well, the first thing they learned was that they could do it. They could actually blunt these attacks, and they were learning all the time. Every day that you went up, every minute that you spent in combat, you were learning something new. So when they got back down on the ground, they'd be animatedly talking about what had happened, what did you do, what did you see, how did you deal with that. This had never been done before, so they were making this up as they went along. So it was really learning on the job, and they learned very successfully and very quickly.
The German Luftwaffe was targeting British convoys of merchant ships to choke off vitally needed supplies. Defending them were Britain's fighter pilots. At the same time as the bread convoy from London was under attack, Spitfires of Britain's 610th Squadron were scrambled from Biggin Hill to engage with another group of Me-109s, roaring over Dover on England's southeast coast, searching for more targets.
This is the start of this, constant tempo of daily battles, fighters coming out to meet them, attacking the bombers, taking on the fighter escorts in these dogfights. So from then on, you've got these daily battles that ebb and flow. The numbers get bigger and bigger and bigger.
The raids continued. 70 German bombers flew in from the west, taking radar stations by surprise, attacking Swansea in Wales. The bombers inflicted serious damage to ships, as well as the city. Meanwhile, Fighter Command wrestled with the problem of multiple simultaneous attacks by the German Air Force. At the same time as attacking Swansea, the German Air Force was bombing the bread convoy over Dover on England's south coast.
The problem for Fighter Command was, what do? Do you engage German Air Force when they're doing this? Because they're not attacking you, they're attacking this convoy.
The RAF's response to this were fighter patrols over the channel and responding to relevant German threats as and when they came up.
Having scrambled a number of squadrons and realising the strengths of the German force, he then scrambled more fighters, and there was a huge dogfight which took place across the convoy.
Over 100 planes wheeled above the bread convoy, engaged in a massive dogfight. British Air Chief Marshal Sir Hugh Dowding's pilots successfully resisted the German attack. The Dowding system, the early warning system of radar and eyesight, also proved invaluable to British defence.
One of the many problems the Germans faced, I think, in the Battle of Britain was that they underestimated the British radar chain completely. So they didn't really realise that once they were being engaged by enemy aircraft, they were being engaged by an aircraft that had been alerted by radar.
Despite the edge the home chain system gave its squadrons, Fighter Command struggled for survival as wave after wave of German fighters attacked British airfields. Impatient to launch his invasion on Britain, Hitler ordered a full-scale aerial assault.
The whole of southern Britain is vulnerable. It can expect to see enemy aircraft, particularly places which fall into this German plan, i.e. the ports like Southampton, later on Plymouth.
As German fighters attacked Britain's convoys, Fighter Command's losses mounted. In under 1 month, 120 British planes had been destroyed or damaged, with nearly 77 pilots killed. The effectiveness of Fighter Command was in serious doubt.
Throughout the summer of 1940, the RAF suffered persistent losses. Coastal Command, which had on the whole pretty slow-flying and ineffective aircraft, also suffered really very heavy losses.
The age band for the Battle of Britain pilots was from about 19 to 23. And the length of time that they stayed alive was not very long at all. It was a matter of weeks for the average pilot. If you got through, say, the first 6 weeks, then you had a much greater chance of surviving. However good they were as pilots, they didn't have a lot of experience at shooting people down and going into combat.
So serious was the shortage of British pilots that training was cut down from 6 months to just 4 weeks. Some arrived on squadrons with only a handful of hours in Spitfires or Hurricanes.
They're not familiar with the machine, and their training is nothing like as thorough as it was for those who were there at the beginning.
By mid-July 1940, British fighter squadrons desperately needed more planes. Lord Beaverbrook, the British newspaper magnate, was given the task of mobilising greater aircraft production.
So he became the Minister of Aircraft Production. And there's no doubt that he did. He shouted at people. He did try to make sure that every effort was being made.
Throughout all of July, Fighter Command had mounted over 12,000 sorties against German planes.
By that stage, the Germans had decided that the most effective way of getting at British shipping in the Channel was to use the dive bomb. but they would need to be escorted, as other bombs would be, of course, by a large body of fighters.
July 14th, the German raiders targeted another convoy of merchant ships heading along England's south coast. 12 Spitfires from the 610th Squadron, together with 7 Hurricanes from the 151st Squadron and 9 from 615th Squadron, were scrambled to meet them. They successfully fought off the raiders. Despite the July raids, the German Luftwaffe was failing to achieve the success Hitler was hoping for, to invade Britain. By contrast, German victory had been achieved over landlocked Europe through lightning airstrikes, the Blitzkrieg. The same tactics couldn't be used across the English Channel Divide, and Britain's fighter pilots were proving harder to defeat.
German aircraft had a number of disadvantages in the Battle of Britain. And most obvious, of course, was that existing fighters had relatively small fuel capacity, and so they could engage in combat over southern England for little more than 20 minutes. And then they had to make their way back, otherwise they were going to crash in the Channel, as many of them did.
As July came to a close, attacks on Dover in the south of England rose in frequency and strength. British pilots were constantly scrambled to take on the German fighters in another fight to the death in the air.
Pilots would probably be woken at about 4 o'clock in the morning. Dressed in their pyjamas, they'd go out to the aeroplanes, which had been looked after all night sometimes by the ground crew. So they didn't sleep at all in many cases, repairing the aircraft, getting them ready. At about 4 o'clock, the pilot would go out, climb into the aeroplane, start it up, make sure everything was ready, shut it down, and then he'd go back to his billet until that terrible noise of the bell going, and then they'd run for their aeroplanes.
This was an exhausting process, so you could be on standby from dawn, you could fly your first operation at 5 o'clock in the morning, and you could still be at it at 9 o'clock at night. You might have gone up 5 or 6 times during that day. You were fighting every minute of daylight.
So that was a not untypical day of a Hurricane or a Spitfire pilot during the Battle of Britain.
Pilots longed for a grey, overcast day to recover from the relentless battles.
It looks like flying is going to be difficult. They're rejoicing because it'll give them a brief respite. The diaries and the letters, such as they are, talk about this sort of awful weariness that you never escape from. Even if you get a day off, you never actually catch up on your sleep. You never get back to that point where you were at the beginning of your tour.
Air Chief Marshal Sir Hugh Dowding ordered his pilots to take 8 hours off in every 24 and a continuous rest of 24 hours each week.
Dowding understood, I think, that there was a limit to what you could ask pilots to do, and it's exhausting, draining to do it day after day. The adrenaline works a bit, but after a while it is a difficult thing to do continuously.
It wasn't only Britain's fighter command that was under pressure. A month after the Battle of Britain began, the German Luftwaffe had lost 500 pilots and crew. There's a lull in hostilities, but it was the quiet before the storm.
At the beginning of August, the shape of the battle starts to alter. The emphasis now is on attacking the RAF, attacking its infrastructure, attacking its bases.
The British airfields weren't the only military targets. The early warning radar system was targeted too. August the 11th, 1940. Isle of Wight radar station at Ventnor reported a heavy raid assembling over the Cherbourg Peninsula. British Spitfires from 609th Squadron at Warmwell and Hurricanes from 145th Squadron from Tangmere were scrambled. 6 others were put on readiness. The day for an all-out assault to destroy British Fighter Command came on the 13th of August, Operation Eagle Day.
Eagle Day is meant to be the climax of the Eagle attack. So this is when the Luftwaffe take on the RAF head-to-head and destroy it.
Goering had been huffing and puffing all the way through August, finally said, now come on, I want you to destroy the RAF in 4 days. I think probably Goering believed it was possible, actually. I think he thought the RAF could be destroyed in 4 days.
German Reichsmarschall Goering demanded nothing less than the total destruction of Fighter Command. And with the fall of Fighter Command, so Britain would fall.
We start to see attacks against RAF Fighter Command airfields in the southeast in an attempt to take out RAF strength and destroy its infrastructure. So we see attacks against airfields such as Manston and Biggin Hill.
On the 16th, 3 days later, Tangmere suffered its worst ever day. It was the most horrendous attack. It started late morning with probably about 70 aircraft, a mixture of Stukas, Junkers 87s, and the twin-engine bombers, the Junkers 88s, setting off from the northern French coast towards Portsmouth.
The German raiders split into separate groups, each headed for Southampton, Portsmouth, and Tangmere.
And 2 formations of Hurricane had been launched from Tangmere. Spitfires, remember, are heading for high level to attack the fighters, and the 2 Hurricane formations are now both heading to try and get up sun to attack these guys as they attack Tangmere.
And this is the main cut and thrust of the period, with the RAF seeking to respond to those threats, scrambling fighters, the old idea of what nowadays we would call quick reaction alert, but scrambling fighters.
5 of the Stukas were shot down into the Solent itself.
During the course of about a 10-hour period or so, launched somewhere in the region of 1,500 sorties against targets in England.
Tangmere was really very, very heavily damaged.
The Battle of Britain stretched pilots of the Royal Air Force to their very limits.
You're dealing with finite resources. You've got men who can only fly so many times a day. Even though they did fly from dawn to dusk, they were facing exhaustion, they were taking losses, etc. Courage is a finite commodity, and I think it's part of their achievement that they were able to keep those reserves of resolve, if you like, going right until the battle was won.
German fighters continued their relentless onslaughts on Britain's airfields in southern England. Their objective? To destroy Britain's air force, to pave the way for the German invasion of Britain.
So in this period, the middle of August, you start seeing really big formations of German bombers, 300 bombers in one formation.
At midday on August the 18th, radar reported the largest build-up yet of German aircraft. Britain's Fighter Group 11 was brought to readiness. Squadron 501 was already in the air, patrolling Canterbury and Margate on England's south coast to protect its airfields. A further 4 British squadrons were ordered up to guard Biggin Hill and Kenley. Meanwhile, the German bombers were approaching their target. First on the list was Kenley Airfield, just 15 miles from London. A group of German bombers crossed the English Channel at 100 feet, avoiding radar detection. Taking advantage of ideal flying conditions, German bombers found their target at Kenley Airfield, destroying all 10 hangars and 6 Hurricanes, killing 12 and injuring 20.
For the RAF, the really important day was August the 18th, because that was the first day of good, clear weather. The Luftwaffe did finally manage to attack a number of important fighter command air stations very seriously.
Right bang in the middle of August, you have 3 days of intense fighting when some of the fighter stations get very badly beaten up.
During the raids on August the 18th, the German Luftwaffe lost twice as many planes as British Fighter Command. But the raids continued relentlessly, every day.
On August 18th, the German Air Force did engage in a number of very heavy raids on fighter command stations across Sussex and Kent, inflicting quite heavy damage, particularly on Biggin Hill and on a number of other stations.
The attack on Biggin Hill Airfield wasn't the only one of its kind. During August 1940, German raids increased pressure on Britain's fighter command.
For the RAF, it was clear that something had changed. It was clear now that the hit-and-run raids, the raids in the Channel and so on, had all been a preliminary. They saw the period from August the 18th, really, as the period when they were up against it.
But it didn't stop there. On the 30th of August, hundreds of German bombers and fighters came across the Channel over Kent in the southeast of England towards the airfields protecting London. British Air Chief Marshal Sir Hugh Dowding's other concern was that his Group Sector 11 stations, including Debden, Kenley and Biggin Hill, were coming under heavy attack.
First week of September for both sides was a grueling time. Both sides were exhausted. The pilots on both sides showed significant anxiety symptoms and so on. The tension of doing this over and over and over again was difficult. Both sides were getting exhausted. One last final effort was made to get a fighter command because breathing down Goering's neck was Hitler saying, am I going to invade? I'm not going to invade. We've got 2 weeks left. What are we going to do? And Goering saying, don't worry, it could be all over in 2 days. So that week, first week in September, very heavy losses on both sides.
6 of the 7 British Group Sector 11 airfields were bombed to the point of collapse. 5 of its advanced airfields were seriously damaged. The German air raids inflicted heavy losses on both sides. After months of unrelenting, furious aerial combat, Air Chief Marshal Sir Hugh Dowding was facing the inevitable: the defeat of British Fighter Command at the hands of the German Luftwaffe.
Towards the end of August 1940, early September, they were actually causing attrition to the RAF.
But just as it seemed the final blows were about to fall, the German Luftwaffe changed tactics.
On the 7th of September 1940, the Luftwaffe shifts its focus of attacks from RAF Fighter Command airfields to industrial targets and civilian targets.
The German air raids that bombed British cities famously became known as the Blitz, but it had a silver lining for Britain's Fighter Command.
This is important for the RAF, in particular Fighter Command, as it gives them a degree of breathing space to be able to recover from losses suffered during the third period of the battle and eventually come back in force.
The change in strategy from bombing British airfields to bombing Britain's cities allowed Fighter Command to regroup and rebuild. It was Reichsmarschall Goering's fatal error.
It begins in the afternoon with a huge raid on London. It's the first time London has really been hit hard. There have been bombs scattered around London, but nothing like this. It's a terrible new development, but at the same time, it's a salvation because the Luftwaffe has switched away from attacking RAF targets, and it's now hit a big target which it can't possibly hope to destroy. This was a terrible mistake by the Germans, a terrible mistake by Hitler.
In the 6 days before the start of the Blitz, Britain's Fighter Command flew nearly 5,000 sorties. In the 6 days after, it flew half that. This allowed Fighter Command to restore its planes, bases, and pilots. On September the 15th, Germany's Luftwaffe assembled for a major raid on London. They were met by 15 British Hurricane squadrons and 8 Spitfire squadrons.
On this day, the Germans launched an all-out attack against Britain, thinking that they had shattered RAF Fighter Command and that they could operate freely over Britain. Much to their surprise, RAF Fighter Command was reinforced, and in aerial battles over London, the Luftwaffe suffered heavy defeats to the British. RAF Fighter Command strength continues to grow, partly as a result of some of the pressure relieved when the Germans changed their attacks to cities.
London was hit by day or by night for the next 56 out of 57 days.
In the afternoon, 400 German fighters escorted 150 bombers, staggered in 3 waves. Britain's RAF scrambled 8 squadrons to patrol over Sheerness, Chelmsford, Kenley and Hornchurch in Essex. 4 more British squadrons were ordered up, and then another 8. A total of 250 British fighters were in the air. For the first time, the German fighters were outnumbered. From the west, a force of 80 German bombers headed across Surrey towards London. They were met by Hurricanes from 217 Squadron and 607 Squadron from Tangmere. They tore into them.
During the Blitz period, the German strategy essentially sought to coerce the British government into surrender. The British public were surprisingly resilient to German attacks and morale remained relatively high, the so-called Blitz spirit.
This time, Britain's fighter command overwhelmed the airborne German raiders.
And they inflicted very heavy damage. 25% of the bomber force destroyed or heavily damaged and so on. No air force can stand that rate of attrition for more than a few days.
As Britain's fighter command rebuilt, the whole defence process of detection, interception and destruction worked.
There's no doubt that the September battles showed that fighter command had finished its apprenticeship. It was now fully trained.
Now experienced and replenished, the full force of Britain's fighter pilots ranged against the failing German Luftwaffe to finish the battle.
The official end of the Battle of Britain was October the 31st, 1940. The invasion plan had not worked.
The battle officially ended on the 31st of October, and the plan to invade Britain is on hold, and there's no prospect of it being resuscitated anytime soon. In fact, Hitler's planning to invade Russia, so the invasion threat to Britain, such as it was, is over.
The Battle of Britain saw the destruction of 1,733 of Germany's Luftwaffe planes. British Fighter Command lost 915 aircraft. Of the 2,917 pilots under Britain's Fighter Command who took part in the air battles of 1940, 544 had died. Britain's Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, famously made a speech in the House of Commons, broadcast on radio, honouring the few, the pilots of Fighter Command.
Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few.
It was one of the great decisive battles of the Second World War.
I think nothing from the Second World War has been more important for the British than the air defence put up by the RAF in 1940. The Battle of Britain became a symbol of British defiance against Hitler, British defiance against the Axis, British defiance against all those forces of darkness that were going to overwhelm the world.
Operation Sea Lion, Hitler's plan to invade Britain, was postponed indefinitely. The Battle of Britain had been won.